Okay, so you want to own a soccer team. Here is the fantasy. You buy the club. Fans fill the stadium every other Saturday. They buy tickets, jerseys, and beer. Television networks pay a fortune for the broadcast rights. Sponsors slap their logos on the shirt. Money pours in from every direction, and you, the owner, sit in your private box while a stadium full of people sings your name, or at least your team's name, which feels close enough. It sounds simple. It isn't. Because here is the question nobody answers honestly at the press conference, where a new billionaire holds up a scarf and smiles for the cameras. If soccer clubs generate this much revenue, why do so many of them lose money almost every single year? Even the famous ones. Even the ones playing in front of sold-out crowds every week. That question sits underneath the entire industry, and it takes the rest of this story to answer it properly. Start with what you are actually buying, because it is not what it looks like. A soccer club is not really a business in the traditional sense. It behaves more like a seat at a private table with extremely limited chairs. There are only 20 clubs in the Premier League. There are only a handful of major leagues in the world that matter financially. You cannot simply build a new one and compete the way you might open a rival coffee chain. The value is not really in the stadium or the players. The value is in the scarcity of the seat itself, and everything else is built on top of that scarcity. So what does it cost to get one of those seats? Not a startup fee, a purchase price, usually paid to whoever owned the scarcity before you. Sometimes that number is shockingly small for what you get. In 2021, Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney bought Wrexham, a fifth-tier Welsh club with a rich history and almost no money, for roughly £2 million. 2 years later, Todd Boehly and his partners paid roughly £4.25 billion for Chelsea, a fee that included both the purchase itself and a commitment to invest thoroughly more money over the following decade. Around the same window, a Saudi-backed consortium paid roughly £300 million for Newcastle United, a club that had been treading water in mid-table mediocrity for years. Same sport, same league in two of those cases. Wildly different price tags, because you are not really pricing a stadium and a training ground. You are pricing a level of scarcity, a fan base, a media market, and a story about what that seat could become. And once you own the seat, the obvious revenue engine turns on immediately. Match day income. Fans buy tickets. They buy hospitality packages. They buy food and drink inside the stadium. Multiply an average ticket price by tens of thousands of seats. Multiply that by roughly 20 home games a season, and the number in front of you looks enormous. For a top-tier club with a large stadium, matchday revenue alone can run into the tens of millions of pounds a year. That sounds like the whole business right there. It isn't. Because matchday revenue has a hard ceiling. There are only so many seats in the building, and there are only so many home games in a season. You cannot simply sell more tickets than the stadium holds, and you cannot add extra fixtures whenever you feel like boosting quarterly numbers. So the industry built a second revenue engine, one with no such ceiling: broadcasting. Television and streaming rights are where the real money in modern soccer actually lives. The Premier League alone sells its domestic and international rights for billions of pounds across a multi-year cycle. And that money is distributed among the clubs based on a formula involving league position, how often a team is shown live, and a share split roughly evenly across the pack. Unlike ticket sales, broadcasting revenue scales with how many people are watching anywhere on the planet, not how many seats exist in one stadium in one city. A club's true financial ceiling is not its city's population. It is the size of the global audience willing to watch that badge on a screen. But that still isn't where the more interesting money hides. Beneath broadcasting sits commercial revenue: shirt sponsorships, stadium naming rights, kit manufacturer deals, regional partnerships sold separately in markets like Southeast Asia or the Middle East, and merchandise sold to a fan base that may never set foot in the stadium at all. This is the layer where charisma storytelling, and global attention translate directly into cash, sometimes faster than results on the pitch do. Wrexham is the clearest recent proof of this. Before its celebrity owners arrived, the club's total revenue as a fifth-tier team sat around £1 million a year. A few seasons and one hit documentary series later, revenue had climbed past £30 million a year. Most of it commercial, not ticket sales, not television money, from a level of football that barely gets broadcast at all. The club hadn't won a trophy that mattered to anyone outside Wales. It had simply become interesting to watch, off the pitch, as much as on it. None of that revenue happens by accident, either. The stadium itself is designed to extract as much value as possible from the exact same crowd that shows up every other Saturday. Seating is split into tiers, and those tiers are priced almost like separate businesses stacked inside one building. General admission covers the cost of running the stadium. Premium seating and hospitality boxes, occupying a small fraction of total capacity, can generate a disproportionate share of matchday income because a corporate client paying for a private box with catering and a guaranteed seat is worth many times more than a fan paying for a single ticket in the upper tier. Concourses are built so fans walk past food stalls, official merchandise shops, and sponsor activations on the way to their seats, not around them. Even kickoff times are chosen with an eye on revenue rather than convenience, shifted to fit international broadcast windows in Asia or North America, instead of the comfort of the fans standing on a cold terrace at home. Every one of these choices looks like a small operational detail. Add them together across 38 league games a season, and they represent the difference between a stadium that merely hosts football and one that behaves like a finely tuned retail environment that happens to have a pitch in the middle of it. Here is where things get expensive, though, because none of this explains why so many owners lose money anyway. The cost side of this machine is brutal, and the single largest cost by far is wages. Player and staff salaries routinely consume anywhere from 50 to over 90% of a club's total revenue, depending on the division and the ambition of the ownership. That is not a typo. A club can generate £30 million in revenue and still hand nearly all of it directly to a playing squad before a single utility bill, insurance premium, or stadium maintenance cost gets paid, and salaries do not shrink when results go badly. A player under contract earning a six-figure weekly wage still earns that wage whether the team wins the league or gets relegated to a division with a fraction of the broadcast money. This is the trap sitting quietly underneath the entire business model. Revenue is unstable. It rises and falls with league position, which is itself unpredictable and violent from one season to the next. Costs, especially wages, are largely fixed, locked into multi-year contracts signed during better times. The revenue can evaporate in a single relegation battle. The wage bill does not evaporate with it. One problem doesn't stay one problem. Watch what happens when relegation hits a club that built its wage structure around Premier League broadcast money. Overnight, the television income that funded those contracts can drop to a fraction of its former size, sometimes down to roughly a tenth of what a club earned in the top flight, even accounting for parachute payments designed to soften the landing. The wages, negotiated when the money was flowing, do not fall at the same speed. The gap between income and obligation widens every single month. That gap has to be filled somehow, usually by an owner injecting personal cash, taking on debt, or selling off the club's best remaining players at a discount, which then makes the team worse, which then makes relegation to an even lower division more likely, which then shrinks revenue again. The spiral feeds itself. Leagues know this problem well enough to have built a shock absorber for it called a parachute payment, a tapering share of top-flight broadcast money paid out over a few seasons after relegation specifically to prevent an instant collapse. It helps, but it does not solve the underlying mismatch. A parachute payment might replace a third or half of the lost broadcast income for 1 or 2 years, while wage contracts signed for a Premier League budget can run 3 or 4 years deep. The cushion runs out well before the obligations do, and clubs that built their spending around the assumption of staying up indefinitely simply postpone the reckoning rather than avoid it. Portsmouth lived this exact spiral, and it is worth walking through slowly because nobody involved was foolish. In 2006, Alexander Gadamek took control of a club that had just stabilized under a previous owner. He spent heavily, tens of millions of pounds, bringing in genuinely talented players and building a squad that would win the FA Cup in 2008 and finish 8th in the Premier League that same year, one of the best runs in the club's history. From the outside, this looked like ambition paying off. The problem was that almost all of it was financed with borrowed money, guaranteed personally against a fortune that was about to be hit hard by the 2008 financial crisis. When that crisis landed, the money behind the club dried up fast. Gadamek had to sell, and whoever bought the club inherited the debt attached to it. Over the following 2 years, Portsmouth changed hands 4 separate times, each new owner discovering a financial hole slightly worse than the last one had disclosed. By February 2010, the club's total debts stood at roughly £100 million. It was placed into administration, docked 9 points as a penalty, and relegated out of the Premier League that same season. Its cup-winning squad sold off piece by piece to keep the lights on. Nobody in that chain was stupid. They were financing ambition with leverage during good times, and the entire structure depended on those good times continuing indefinitely. They didn't. Manchester United tells a different version of the same underlying risk, on a scale that makes Portsmouth look small. In 2005, the Glazer family completed a leveraged buyout of the club, borrowing roughly £600 million and loading that debt directly onto a franchise that had been debt-free before they arrived. This is the core mechanic of a leveraged buyout. The buyer uses relatively little of their own money and instead borrows against the asset itself, meaning the club's own future revenue is what services the debt, not the buyer's personal wealth. It worked in the narrow sense that the family kept control and the club kept winning trophies for years. But interest payments do not care about results on the pitch. Across the 2 decades since that takeover, Manchester United's cumulative interest costs on that debt have climbed past £1 billion, money that produced no player, no trophy, and no stadium improvement. It simply serviced a loan taken out to buy the club in the first place. Meanwhile, the family has also drawn well over £100 million in dividends out of the club during that period. None of this technically bankrupted the franchise. Manchester United remains one of the most commercially valuable clubs on the planet. But an entire generation of the club's own revenue, money that could have funded transfers, wages, or infrastructure, was instead redirected toward paying off the very debt used to acquire the club, a quiet compounding cost most fans in the stadium never see on a scoreboard. So why does anyone still want in? Because scale changes the math completely, and this is where the smartest operators separate themselves from the rest. At small scale, a club is almost entirely dependent on a single revenue stream, usually matchday income, and a single bad season can be fatal. At a healthy mid-sized scale, a club with several revenue streams, matchday, broadcasting, and modest commercial deals, can absorb one bad result without collapsing, though relegation risk still looms over everything. At the largest scale, something different happens entirely. A handful of clubs, the ones with genuinely global fan bases, generate commercial and broadcast revenue so large that on-field results barely move the needle financially. Manchester United, Real Madrid, and a handful of others sell shirts and streaming subscriptions to fans on every continent, regardless of where they finish in a given season. At that scale, one extra pound of average revenue per fan, multiplied across hundreds of millions of followers worldwide, creates a financial cushion no mid-table club could ever build no matter how well it plays. Scale does not just make these clubs richer, it makes them structurally safer, insulated from exactly the spiral that destroyed Portsmouth. Scale also unlocks an entirely different revenue engine that smaller clubs rarely get to use well: player trading. A club with a strong scouting network and a respected academy can buy or develop young talent cheaply and sell it on for a substantial multiple once that talent matures, sometimes turning a profit of tens of millions of pounds on a single transfer. This is not a side hustle. For some mid-size European clubs, profit from player sales is the single largest source of positive cash flow in a given year, occasionally larger than match day and commercial income combined. But this engine has its own hidden requirement. It only works reliably for clubs with either an elite scouting operation or a league position, attractive enough to draw talent cheaply in the first place, which quietly circles back to the same truth sitting under everything else in this business. Scarcity, reputation, and scale reinforce one another, and clubs without any of the three end up buying players at the top of the market and selling them, if forced to, at the bottom of it. The future of this business is being shaped by forces mostly outside the sport itself. Financial fair play and profitability regulations, introduced across major leagues specifically because of stories like Portsmouth's, now restrict how much clubs can lose relative to revenue, forcing owners to treat these franchises more like disciplined businesses and less like personal vanity projects. Streaming has begun fragmenting broadcast rights away from single national broadcasters toward a wider, more global, more direct-to-fan model, which increases the ceiling for clubs that can build an international audience the way Wrexham did almost by accident. Private equity has moved aggressively into the sport over the last several years, bringing disciplined capital and demanding return structures that traditional football ownership, historically run more like a fan's dream than a fund, has never really had to answer to before. Sovereign wealth has also become a permanent fixture in the ownership landscape rather than a passing curiosity, and it changes the calculation in a way ordinary financial metrics struggle to capture. When a buyer's primary goal is influence, prestige, or a long-term national strategy rather than a near-term return, spending decisions stop following the logic of a typical business owner altogether. And clubs backed by that kind of capital can absorb years of heavy losses that would sink almost anyone else. At the same time, academy investment is quietly becoming one of the more rational long-term plays in the sport, since a well-run youth system produces both cheaper first-team talent and a pipeline of future transfer profit, reducing a club's dependence on the volatile broadcast money that destroyed Portsmouth. Every one of these trends points toward the same outcome. Soccer clubs are slowly being forced to behave like the financial assets they were quietly turning into all along, even while a shrinking number of them are financed by owners who were never trying to make money in the first place. So does owning a soccer team actually make financial sense? At small scale, rarely, and the wreckage of clubs like Portsmouth proves it. At a healthy mid-size scale, only with discipline, patience, and an owner willing to absorb years of losses the way Reynolds and McElhenney did at Wrexham, before revenue finally caught up to ambition. At the largest scale, among the small handful of truly global brands, the economics work extraordinarily well, not because those clubs win more often, but because their revenue no longer depends on winning at all. So if you do decide to own a soccer team, understand what you are actually buying. You are not buying a stadium. You are buying one of a small number of scarce seats at a table that almost never adds new chairs. You are not buying 11 players. You are buying a claim on the attention of millions of people who may never once sit in your stadium. And you are not buying a guarantee of profit. You are buying exposure to one of the most emotionally driven, financially unforgiving businesses in the world. One where the crowd's love for the badge is real, permanent, and utterly indifferent to whether you, the owner, ever make a single pound back.